In this, the 42nd lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we examine the fleeting success of Ireland's leaders to stimulate economic development and to stem the outmigration of its people to the far corners of the globe. Ireland's leaders during the 1920s and 1930s were focused on full independence from Great Britain. The economy was certainly an important concern, but not yet subject to systematic government intervention. During these early decades of political independence, agricultural exports were the primary source of revenue for government and income for producers. Much of what Ireland's farmers produced was exported to Britain, which had the effect of making the Irish economy highly dependent on British economic policy toward agricultural imports. During the years of the Great Depression, Ireland protected its domestic industries by imposing tariffs on imported goods. Fianna Fáil, the party in power, encouraged new industries in order to supply the goods that were no longer being imported. A Control of Manufacturers Act was passed to ensure that any new industries were Irish-owned. During the Second World War, Irish economists debated the policy options to be followed after the war. At the core of the policy debate was whether Ireland should continue to protect industries or reduce protective tariffs. Sean McEntee, former Minister for Finance during the 1930s, defended Ireland's protective tariffs. Most conservatives held the same views. The general opinion was that the small protected industries set up in the 1930s would not survive if they had to face competition. Business owners also made significant financial contributions to the Fianna Fáil party to help assure tariffs remained in place. With few imports coming in, Ireland had built up a large trade surplus during the Second World War. High prices were less of a concern than the risk of rising unemployment should the tariffs be lifted. Anticipating recessionary pressures with the end of war, Irish leaders developed a program for government investment. As in the United States, the leaders recognized the need for rural electrification. Equally important was the replacement of poor quality residential structures in Dublin and other cities. A government report issued in 1945 estimated that 100,000 new housing units were needed. The key issues were the availability of land and building materials. Poverty remained a serious social problem in Ireland, and malnutrition during the war sparked a sharp increase in various diseases. The construction of new hospitals was planned and eventually begun during the term of Noel Browne as health minister. Ireland also benefited from the Marshall Plan, with financial aid coming in 1949. The Irish government developed a long-term recovery program as a condition of U.S. assistance. To the dismay of members of the business community and economists, the government directed almost the entire assistance into two projects: land drainage and forestry. The greatest threat to Ireland's post-war economy was the decision by the British government to begin to subsidize their own farmers. Wartime food shortages convinced Britain's leaders of the need to be far more self-sufficient in food production. By 1951, it was almost impossible to sell pork or poultry products to Britain. The sale of butter continued only because the Irish taxpayers subsidized it heavily. Only beef sales remained high. As a consequence, the trade surplus accumulated during the war quickly disappeared. In 1951, the coalition minister, Patrick McGilligan, tried to cut imports by raising tariffs. When Fianna Fáil won the 1951 election, Sean Lemass again pushed for change, but Eamon de Valera backed the conservative Sean McEntee. Sean McEntee became Minister for Finance. He continued to raise tariffs and the economy went into deep recession. Between 1951 and 1957, the economy contracted by 1% each year. Industries which could not afford the high price of imported raw materials closed, and more than 8,000 industrial jobs were lost. Many displaced workers were forced to emigrate. Throughout the 1950s, an average of 40,000 people emigrated each year. In the worst year, 1957, almost 60,000 Irish citizens left for other parts of the globe. In 1956, the Second Coalition government came to power. T.K. Whitaker was appointed Secretary to the Department of Finance. The depth of the recession shocked him into supporting change. He began to draw up a plan for a new economic approach. Early in 1957, Fianna Fáil won the general election with an overall majority. This time, Sean Lemass was able to overcome Eamon de Valera's doubts and get the party to support a change of economic policy. The first step was to accept Whitaker's plan. In 1958, it was published as the Program for Economic Recovery. Still, even under this new plan, the government was committed to expanding agricultural output, bringing marginal land into use by additional drainage. However, the plan also proposed movement away from protection and towards free trade. Economists argued that Irish industry must become competitive, or eventually the pressure would be too great and Ireland's industries would essentially disappear. Another part of the plan was to end the policy of insisting that industry must be Irish-owned. This would require the repeal of the Control of Manufacturers Act. A third part of the plan was to encourage foreign firms to establish production operations in Ireland. Export of these goods would improve the balance of payments and at the same time give valuable training and experience to Irish workers and managers. Guinness, analysts realized, could not carry the economy. As the above policies were adopted, the Irish economy was lifted out of recession. From 1959 to 1964, the nation's GDP grew by an average of 3% each year. In 1960, 75% of merchandise exports went to the UK. Thus, Ireland's leaders sought to penetrate other markets to reduce Ireland's dependency on Britain. New, younger leaders were coming into their own in Ireland. Sean Lemass promoted them and gave them responsibility over economic and social reforms. This is a photograph of the new cabinet that came into office in June of 1959. In 1961, Ireland moved further in the direction of free trade, joining the GATT and the World Bank. Ireland also applied to join the European Economic Community. The French vetoed Britain's entry, which extended to Ireland as well. Some Irish leaders were thankful, as this gave the nation time to build a stronger base. Ireland finally came into the EEC in 1973. Remarkably, a small number of Irish immigrants had begun to return. The 1966 census showed the first significant increase in population since independence. In 1972, the Irish agricultural economist Raymond Crotty opposed Ireland's accession to the European Economic Union, a position he never reversed. Crotty saw the policies of the Irish government as opposed to the real interests of the people. It is not difficult to identify the nature of the change that is necessary to transform Irish undevelopment into development. It involves essentially eliminating banking privilege. In Ireland, producers are charged too little for land and capital and too much for labor. All taxes should be removed from labor and the things that labor buys. Tax revenue from land and from the financial system should be maximized. The state is the enemy of the nation and has been the cause of its undevelopment. This point the Irish people must comprehend. But even as the nation has been undeveloped by the state's actions, the people have looked more and more to the state to remedy this situation. Between 1977 and 1981, Ireland's government adopted expansionary macroeconomic policies in an attempt to achieve full employment. As a result, the public sector spending rose to over 20% of GDP, and government debt climbed to 120% of GDP. Ireland's next important move was to join the European monetary system in 1978. Despite becoming a member of the European Monetary Union, Ireland's central bank adopted measures in 1979 to protect its currency. The bank introduced exchange control regulations that limited capital transactions outside the sterling area. These exchange control regulations were eventually dismantled in the early 1990s. Thus, by 1992, the Irish economy had become a fully open economy, not only for commodities and labor, but also for investment in production industries and finance. Then, even before the end of 1992, Ireland's currency experienced an exchange rate crisis and had to be devalued. More important to the people of Ireland, the effort to achieve full employment was failing. Even though employment had grown by some 72,000 between 1988 and 1993, the number of people unemployed also grew by 3,000 to 220,000. In 2000, a report on the Irish economy by Antoine Murphy offered a very positive view on the state of the Irish economy. The Irish economy's current performance is most impressive. High and sustained economic growth, low inflation, a current account balance of payment surplus, falling unemployment, net immigration, and a growing budget surplus are the stuff of macroeconomists' dreams. All the key macroeconomic indicators are positive. Ireland, traditionally a laggard behind the UK economy, has now a per capita GDP which exceeds that of the UK. The metaphor, the Celtic tiger, first coined by Morgan Stanley in August 1994, has become the fashionable neologism for the Irish economy. Globalization enabled Ireland to move from the periphery towards the center of the new global economy. Raymond Crotty, continuing to oppose Ireland's involvement in the European Economic Community, stood for election in 1989 to the European Parliament. Although he only received about 5.7% of the vote, he is remembered for winning a court case against the Irish government, ensuring that the Irish people would have the opportunity to approve or reject any EU rules that raise constitutional questions for Ireland. Thanks to generous tax breaks offered to foreign corporations, by the year 2000, Ireland became the second largest exporter of packaged computer software in the world after the United States. A dozen top electronics companies and all of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies had plants in Ireland. However, Ireland did not escape the consequences of the 2008 global financial markets crash. During the boom years, the banks in Ireland were anxious to provide the credit to meet the needs of a rapidly expanding demand for housing. Then, as elsewhere around the globe, property prices collapsed, unemployment increased, borrowers defaulted on mortgage loans, and the banks and other mortgage loan investors experienced losses threatening their solvency. By the middle of 2010, some 300,000 residential properties sat empty. The head of Ireland's financial regulator, Patrick Neary, expressed confidence that new liquidity requirements imposed on Irish banks would limit their exposure to losses from investment in the private label mortgage-backed securities in the United States. Brian Cohen, at the time still Prime Minister, commented, "No one should underestimate the scale of the challenge that faces us. We are in new economic territory. No one should think that it will be easy to overcome, and no one should think that any politician, any economist, or any leading figure in business has the easy solution." The numbers of people living on unemployment benefits rose to 326,000 in January 2009, the highest monthly level since records began in 1967. The official unemployment rate rose from 6.5% in July 2008 to 14.8% by July 2012. One effect of the urban property market crash was a general increase in the price of agricultural land for the first time in 6 years. According to the Irish Farmers Journal Agricultural Land Price Report 2012, the average price per acre went up by 14.3% in 2011, after falling by 50% between 2006 and 2011. The Irish government decided to save the banks and borrowed heavily to do so from financial institutions within the Eurozone. On a per capita basis, Ireland was the most indebted country in the EU, with a budget deficit higher than that of Greece. Ireland's government cut public sector spending almost across the board. Nearly 20,000 Irish nationals emigrated in the year between April 2008 and April 2009. Many others followed in search of employment. The trend has continued each year at a pace of about 30,000 departures. However, with economic recovery, some are returning along with an increasing number of non-Irish nationals. From having virtually no major export industries, Ireland became a significant location for U.S. high-tech companies competing in the European market. Changes in U.S. tax laws passed in 2017 may prompt many corporations to bring billions of dollars kept offshore back to repurchase shares of stock and distribute profits as dividends to shareholders. Ireland's corporate tax rate is just 12.5%, attracting many companies to establish a major presence in Ireland. Just how important these companies are is expressed by Tony Foley, an economics professor at Dublin City University Business School. These companies account for 90% of all our manufactured exports, employ around 10% of the workforce, and they help pull Ireland out of the Eurozone debt crisis. Without the multinationals, we would be much closer to Greece and Portugal than we would like to think. As of 2013, there were over 700 U.S. firms with operations in Ireland, employing over 115,000 people. These companies owned or leased nearly 40% of all office space in Dublin. The list of U.S. firms includes Google, Facebook, Intel, Boston Scientific, Dell, IB, Citi, Hewlett-Packard, Johnson & Johnson, and BNY Mellon. At the same time, there are over 500 Irish companies operating in the United States. These firms are involved in agri-food manufacturing, building materials, construction, and services. Economists have observed that early on, the absence of a large industrial base actually helped Ireland. The government provided significant tax advantages which would have been difficult, if not impossible, to make if a large industrial base already existed. Perhaps more important, the lack of industrialization meant the absence of obsolete capital goods and rigid labor practices. While there are acknowledged analytical problems associated with use of gross domestic product as a measure of real economic growth, GDP figures for Ireland show a dramatic increase in spending since the beginning of recovery from the 2008 meltdown. The arrival of so many foreign companies pulled the Irish Stock Exchange upward, reaching a peak of 10,000 points in April 2007 before crashing. The exchange fell to a 14-year low of 1,987 points on the 24th of February 2009. In March of 2018, all shares of the Irish Stock Exchange were acquired by Euronext, enabling the exchange to benefit from state-of-the-art proprietary technology and operating rules consistent with other exchanges. Stock prices of Irish companies have experienced considerable price volatility even as the overall economy is again growing. As Ireland worked its way out of the financial collapse and recession, demand for residential properties in Dublin continued to increase, putting upward pressure on the available supply. At the same time, land in Ireland once earmarked for homes and offices was being sold at reduced prices to farmers, sometimes the same farmers who experienced huge gains selling it in the boom years. Ghost estates arose throughout Ireland, from Dublin to the popular vacation spots. On this small island, about 75% of the vacation homes were empty in 2012, and 20% were in some stage of foreclosure. Gradually, the inventory of unsold houses in and around Dublin began to find buyers. Tightened controls over bank lending brought a dramatic slowdown in new housing construction, eventually causing a housing shortage and rising property prices. The average price of a residential property in Dublin increased by €150,000 between 2013 and 2018. In March of 2013, Ireland's Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, spoke at the London School of Economics. Saturday last marked 2 years since my government took office. The Irish people gave Fine Gael and the Labour Party a clear mandate to take the necessary decisions to achieve economic recovery and get Ireland working again. We inherited then a country and economy in deep crisis. Ireland had just been forced into a bailout arrangement. The public finances were out of control. Banks were on the brink of collapse. Jobs were being decimated at an alarming rate. Our international reputation was in tatters. Since then, my government has been working with the Irish people to implement our agreed plan for economic recovery. If only Fine Gael and the Labour Party were listening to British analyst Fred Harrison when he spoke to a large audience at Trinity College, Dublin, in April 2010, the path to recovery might have been much smoother, while also going a long way toward preventing yet another asset bubble in the nation's property markets. He said, "The fact is that Ireland at the present time is completely uncompetitive in the real economy. The Celtic Tiger was a false model of economic development. It was a bubble economy. It was built on two things: huge inflows of other people's tax money from Europe to help with the infrastructure investment. The second element of the Celtic Tiger was your tax policies. Because of the kinds of policies that were in place, all that money came flooding in, supplemented by investment from other corporations, meant only one thing, and that was a bubble in the property market that was going to collapse. Do you not think that land prices might be revealing something about the economy that economists and the people who advise governments ought to pay attention to? Well, they don't. Fred Harrison's warnings are echoed in remarks made earlier in 2018 by Cliff Taylor, managing editor of the Irish Times. Taylor wrote, "The economic boom is back, this time the same, only different. And the government and policymakers face the big question. Can we stop ourselves moving into another cycle of boom and bust? Are ministers serious when they say they want to move the economy into steady and sustainable growth? And can they accelerate progress in dealing with the remaining scars of the crisis, notably homelessness?"